I have to say that I'm really hugely impressed by the focus which the BUC Engagement Forum is putting on the SDGs this year. And indeed, listening to Craig earlier on, I have to say that it's wonderful to think that there is this activism continuing about the SDGs. I mean, obviously, in Chris's case, with a particular emphasis on the environment, but at a time when there must be limited opportunities here because of the government being in suspense, etc. So, it's great that you're not letting the grass grow under your feet, as it were, almost literally, that you are using the time to raise the profile of the many issues covered by the SDGs, but in particular on the environmental side. So as Chris said, my role was that I was the Irish ambassador to the UN until about 5 years ago. And the way it works at the UN is that they often ask an ambassador from what's called the global north, from the developed countries, to link up with an ambassador from the global south to chair negotiations which are difficult and sensitive. And the theory being that the person from the global north will have some sense of the concerns of developed countries, and then the same for the ambassador from the global south. I don't mean to suggest that countries are either developed or developing. They're all sort of on a spectrum really in between, and that's one of the novelties of the SDGs. So it fell to me and to the ambassador of Kenya to chair these negotiations in the years 2014 to 15. I'll be frank and say it was the biggest success the UN ever had. I mean, it was widely recognized at the time because it was the most ambitious thing the UN had ever undertaken. Now, when I say the UN, I really mean 193 countries. There are 193 countries in the world, and every one of them had to give their approval, or had to be involved in the negotiation of this new set of goals. Just to go back very briefly, some of you may recall that around the year 2000, there were so-called Millennium Development Goals. There were about 8 of those, and they focused on traditional development objectives such as health and education. But the key thing was they were not actually negotiated. They were simply dreamt up by a couple of UN officials on the back of an envelope, more or less, and announced. The feeling then was, those goals, those Millennium Goals, were meant to last for 15 years, up to 2015. But during that period, the view took hold that we had to bring in, number one, we had to bring in the concept of sustainable development, which, although it has been around for 30, 40 years, has only really acquired traction in the last decade or so. And that means, it has been touched on by some of the earlier speakers, it means looking at development as a kind of a holistic concept which spans 3 dimensions. In no particular order: the economic dimension, the social dimension, and the environmental dimension. So those 3 dimensions together comprise the concept of sustainable development, development which is going to last and will not do damage to the environment, and which is compatible in all areas of or with all areas of human existence. In other words, we want balanced economic policies which will not undermine the good work that might be done in the environmental area. And I think it was Craig who highlighted that. And equally, we want to keep the social dimension very much to the fore, and that really means tackling poverty. So going for development outcomes which will lift the poorest people in the world out of poverty. So the concept of sustainable development really gathered momentum in the years coming up to 2015. Secondly, there was a feeling that this time round, every country in the world must be involved in setting this new global agenda. Every country had a stake in what we were going to be doing. Big or small, rich or poor, every country was going to be involved. So that meant that they had to have negotiations at the UN involving 193 countries. And myself and my Kenyan colleague had to chair the negotiations. And what that really meant was we had to put successive drafts of the eventual agreement on the table listen to generally speaking, the complaints from many of the countries, and then try to adjust them, try to revise them, until the point where we finally got consensus. Consensus meant that every country in the world signed up to this new agenda without reservation. I'm proud about that. That at the end of it all, although it was heavy going, we got it through without a single country demurring, as it were. In addition to the 17 goals, you have, each of the goals is simply a headline. And for those of you who don't know them so well, of course, the goals are not just those colourful icons that you'll be familiar with. That's simply a shorthand version. So, one of those colourful icons might say life underwater or something. That's for the marine environment goal. But there is a sentence, there's an actual full sentence that goes with it, plus 7 or 8 individual targets under each goal. The targets would be like sub-goals. So if there's a health goal, then a target might deal with maternal health or child health or infectious diseases or something. So the total package, 17 goals and 169 sub-goals, as it were, targets, had to be agreed. And in addition, we had to have a declaration which would set out what the world leaders were trying to do with these goals, what they intended. I had a lot to do with the drafting. The Kenyan colleague did a lot of tic-tacking with, in particular, African countries, but I came up with some of the concepts which are being used as sort of slogans for the SDGs. One of them is the phrase, "Leave no one behind." I didn't absolutely invent that, but I sort of saw it somewhere and I used it in a different context. I gave it prominence. And the phrase goes, as we, that's the world leaders, as we set out on the road to 2030, because that's the time frame for achieving the goals. As we set out on the road to 2030, we will leave no one behind. What do we mean by that? Sounds rather idealistic or even utopian. It meant that every country was pledging that it would prioritise the needs of the poorest, the most marginalised, the most vulnerable. And one of the important things in that phrase is the notion that it's all focused on people, on individual persons, as opposed to the needs of countries. So again, whether we actually get to that remarkable condition, I'm not sure, where we have actually left no one behind, but every country has pledged that it will leave no one behind. And then in a second sentence, which I did invent myself, and we pledged to reach the furthest behind first. So what I meant by that was the first 3 or 4 years. To my surprise, every country in the world agreed to that phrase. And the reason I mention all this is some of you are involved in activism at community level, at local level. These phrases were intended to be sticks with which we could beat governments. We could say, you promised to leave no one behind. And, we have to hold governments to account. I should say I'm no longer a government official. I'm civil society now. I'm retired. But so that phrase, leave no one behind, is actually relevant to some of the activities of community and voluntary groups at local level, both in Northern Ireland and in every other part of the world. We mean by that people who are, let's say, elderly, disabled, living with disabilities, people who have suffered from discrimination of various kinds, human rights abuses, the most marginalised people. That's what the phrase was meant to cover. The goals are not legally binding. I wish in a way that they could have been legally binding, but it would have been completely unrealistic to imagine that every country in the world would agree to put itself into a kind of a straitjacket, so that if it didn't achieve these goals at a certain pace and by 2030, that it would be kind of punished for not having done so. Many small countries with very little resources, no bureaucracy, no statistics, which is relevant here. Many of them feared that they would be somehow blamed or punished by the richer countries for not doing enough on the SDGs. So it was never realistic that we were going to have a legally binding framework. But what I describe it as is a politically binding framework. The summit which launched the SDGs was the biggest event ever at the UN. Presidents and prime ministers from every single country, even the Pope, came along, and they took very seriously the commitments they were making. So that's why we in civil society need to hold them to account for that. But it's politically binding, it's even morally binding, but it's not actually legally binding. All that the countries have agreed to is that by 2030, they will achieve all the goals. Now, I'm being a bit ironic in saying all that they have agreed to is that. That's a pretty utopian state of affairs. And in the meantime, what has happened? The year I'm talking about is 2015. That's when we agreed the goals. There's a 15-year time span. In the meantime, we've had COVID. We've also now had the Ukraine war. COVID has been a big setback, there's no doubt. A setback in terms of the resources available for implementing the SDGs. It has knocked back the sort of political commitment of many countries because they have been struggling to rebuild health systems and so on. But on the other hand, remember, there is a health goal. So in a way, much of what countries have had to do in responding to COVID is directly relevant to implementing the SDGs. In the health goal, we promised to, and I should know them all by heart, I don't actually, but something like we promised to provide quality, affordable healthcare for every human being. Something like that is the health goal. So obviously, as countries try to improve their health coverage, they are implementing the SDGs. To put it in a nutshell, you might think that the SDGs would have become less relevant because countries were so damaged by COVID and the continuing fallout. In fact, it's been the opposite. To my pleasant surprise, at the UN, they're now saying the SDGs are more important than ever because this is the only way in which we can build a world which will protect us all from disasters like the pandemic, from inequalities which have been made worse by the pandemic. So the SDGs in a way are a global blueprint to which every country uniquely has signed up. There was never anything like this before, where we've all agreed on a set of objectives which cover almost literally everything under the sun. They cover health, energy, water, human rights, gender equality, sustainable cities, sustainable oceans, peaceful and inclusive societies, and I'll come to that in a second. So that the agenda is vast, it's highly ambitious, it is quantifiable in the sense that the targets use levels of achievement that we have all agreed on. The world, far from throwing out this agenda as kind of unrealistic, is saying we have to stick to this agenda. The only question in my mind is, will it all be done by 2030? I don't think so. I think, don't quote me, it could be 2040, but I think we're becoming more realistic now that because of COVID, because of the impact of the Ukraine war, that things will simply be a bit slower. But there's no doubt that this is the right agenda. Nobody anywhere has said the SDGs are wrong. Even Russia, let me put it like that, Russia is notoriously contrarian about many things at the UN. Russia did not object to the SDGs. China thought they were wonderful. So the countries from whom we might have been expecting trouble were in fact all completely on board and are. In fact, countries are getting more and more enthusiastic for the SDGs each year. There's a way in which they are being measured at global level. It's a particular conference in New York each year. So look, I won't go on to that. I just wanted to give you a sort of a quick overview of what the SDGs are about, why they are important. Let me add that they are the only uncontested global agenda. The Paris Agreement, for example, is, of course, very, very largely accepted. But then you had Trump a couple of years ago taking the US out. Now the US are back in. But the SDGs are accepted without, even by Trump. Now, he wasn't particularly keen on them. He didn't like the idea of the UN controlling any aspect of life in America. But the US is as on board for the SDGs under current president as any other country. So nobody has any reservations. I say all this because I just want to emphasize how important they are for every government. So to take the Irish government, for example, obviously it's a situation I know best. It is very committed to them. There is a national SDGs platform, which includes government departments, civil society, academia, the private sector, all the stakeholders. And that arrangement is more or less mirrored in every country in the world. It was agreed that they would all do this, that it's not just governments who dreamt this up. The whole thing came together through a kind of a collective exercise at the UN involving every government, but also civil society. And I know that because part of my, I made sure that civil society were given complete access to the negotiations and that they would leave their imprint on the actual document. So civil society were sort of present at the birth of the SDGs, and therefore they have a huge interest worldwide in promoting them and also helping to monitor progress. So let me move now just to the local, the community and voluntary sector. I know I'm racing through this a bit, but there's a lot of ground to cover. The community and voluntary sector was always seen, when we were doing these negotiations, it was always seen as one of the vital players, partly because of the dynamism, the vision, the energy which exists in this sector worldwide. I mean, here I'm talking about a global view. But partly also we genuinely wanted to make sure that governments would be held to account. Increasingly, there is more emphasis on what can be done, what must be done at local level. The SDGs are a global framework, but the action to implement them has to be taken at local level. And by that, I mean really at district level in every country. We're not just talking about, if you like, they will be implemented at various levels, at global level, at regional in the sense of Western Europe or Western Africa, at national level, but now increasingly the focus is on what cities can do, what local authorities can do, even down to further sub-units. It's partly because cities are actually, they already provide many of the basic services which are covered by the SDGs. They're raring to go. They actually get impatient with national governments sometimes because they feel that national governments aren't doing enough. And let me give you a concrete example. In the US, you'll have, let's say, a Republican, you had a Republican government which was kind of dragging its feet a bit on the SDGs. But the cities, many of the cities in the US have Democrat administrations, and on the whole, they are more socially aware. So you have, let's say, the mayor of New York or the mayor of Chicago or the mayor of Los Angeles who would be fired up about the SDGs. In the same way, cities in Europe, many of them are heavily involved. And I mention all this because we're in a city, and I think Belfast, from what I just heard now, the council's activity, it's clear to me that Belfast is also a city which has a great contribution to make, and even my own city, Dublin, is not too far behind. So local authorities can actually galvanize some of the effort needed to implement them. Of course, initiatives will be taken by individual community groups, and we've heard this morning wonderful examples of what's happening and what can happen. Local authorities can fund some of that. They can provide some of the funding. Private sector can also provide funding. It varies a bit around the world. I mean, I was struck by clearly there is some state money involved in some of the projects here, but in other countries it might be that there's no state funding involved. it varies hugely. The philanthropic community, for example, philanthropic foundations, the private sector, the private sector is extremely supportive of the SDGs. Again, I wasn't expecting that, but to simplify it very briefly, the private sector on the one hand see potentially huge markets opening up for their various products and services. That's good, provided they are willing to accept sustainability principles. So the private sector value the SDGs as a means of opening up new markets for them. But on the other hand, they want to show that they, as in companies and businesses, are also committed to the principles underlying the SDGs. So you might have heard the term corporate social responsibility. So many companies see the SDGs as a way of demonstrating that. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that we have an array of so-called stakeholders who are all supporting the SDGs, whether it is community and voluntary sector, whether the academic community, universities, research bodies, philanthropy organizations, international organizations, and governments. They're all meant to be working in the same direction. So I'll sort of leave it at that, really. I mean, I'd love to hear questions and so on. And there's obviously a lot that I could talk about, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how the SDGs came together internationally, as it were, and why they are important for every society. One last thing I'll say is that it has been agreed that every country will report on its own progress in implementing the SDGs. So that has been underway now for several years, and they do so through something called a voluntary national review, VNR. So Ireland, for example, has done it already twice. You go to the UN and you present a report on how your country has been doing. Britain has done it, I think, once in the UK a couple of years ago. This is an opportunity to showcase, as it were, not only what the government is doing, but what community and voluntary groups are also doing. And I think it's very important, and many people think it's very important, that community and voluntary groups should be given a chance to actually go to New York as part of a country's presentation. There's then a sort of a dialogue there where other countries are free to ask, say, the Irish delegation, well, what are you doing on this or on that? There's a big emphasis on mutual learning and on exchanges of best practice. We're not trying to catch out some country because it isn't doing enough, or the basis is one of mutual support. So really, I mentioned this because I'm actually curious to know, how will Northern Ireland be able to, how can it register what it is doing as part of, let's say, a UK report on the SDGs when that comes up in a couple of years' time? I don't have the answer to that, but it seems to me that there's a case to be made for Northern Ireland reporting on its own, that it should be able to offer it a kind of a localized report. And there is increasing emphasis at the UN on local, so-called voluntary local review. That's to help these cities, say in New York or Los Angeles, who want to show what they are doing. So in the same way, I think that Northern Ireland theoretically could present its own report, or as part of a UK presentation. I'm not quite sure, but anyway, I'll leave it at that. I've probably spoken too long, but it was just to give you a flavour of both the global and how important the local also is in the thinking at the UN.